by our very birth, we owe something before anything is due to us. We owe a debt to our parents and ultimately to God.
And those are the two relationships which Aquinas would say we can never really do perfect justice in that we can't return the gift that was given.
The idea that it's good for me to do good to others, that to have good relationships, to live well in community is part of my own flourishing. And so justice, first and foremost, is about how can I live well in community.
I see myself fundamentally as existing in relationship to other people, or do I see other people as most likely impinging upon me or getting in my way?
When you're going through a tough time, actually to think about what can I give of myself in this situation, you receive in the measure that you give of yourself, and giving yourself away is a way of ultimately receiving even more. Hello, I'm Father John Church.
Hello, I'm Fr Toby Lees.
And welcome to Good Habits, our podcast exploring questions of meaning through the tradition of the virtues. And today we're going to look at the virtue of justice, which is all about good relationships, how we relate well to one another. And just as a starting point, it's interesting to think that it's perhaps a virtue, an idea that's most deeply rooted in us as human beings. I think you can think of any child in the playground who just say, that's not fair.
Well, were you one of those really whiny kids? Because you're youngest of 5, aren't you? Were you always going like, Mummy, it's not fair, like they're not letting me have my turn?
I had a very strong sense of justice, of course.
Yes,
Indeed.
Not whiny, strong sense
exactly,
of justice.
Strong sense of justice.
Whereas
exactly.
I was an only child, so I just got whatever I wanted.
Indeed. But the idea of justice and fairness is two ideas we often equate. The idea that something's not fair, something's right to me, or can think of a group of children being a classic experiment, get them to cut up the pizza themselves to share it, to see will they divvy it up fairly. There's this idea that's very interesting in us. Justice, though, is another word that has a huge range of meanings. Are there things that you think, if you, again, ask someone on the street and say, what's justice, what do you think they might say?
I think a lot of people would immediately go to the law courts.
And we think of law courts and the government.
And now I think we think of racial justice, social justice. Justice is probably of all the virtue names that we're going to be discussing is the one that you most commonly hear in the press, in the media, in our everyday discourse.
Yeah, and on that latter one, definitely questions of rights, as in different various human rights and protecting the rights of others and social justice and so on. As a way into how I think we're going to unpack this, C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity has a wonderful image when he talks about the moral life being like a voyage of a group of ships. And he says it shows that to live a moral life, you really need 3 things. Firstly, the ships need to be sailing together and not colliding. If they keep bumping into each other, it's going to be pretty hopeless. Secondly, each ship itself needs to be functioning well, engines working or sails or the oarsmen, depending on their mode of power. And thirdly, they need to reach their destination. As he puts it, if they set out for Sydney and arrive in New York, not a great voyage. Yeah. And the virtue of justice principally has to do with this first element of the ships not colliding. It's a virtue that governs how we relate to one another, our relationships.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting to think about because often we think of it in terms of what's due to us.
Yeah.
That might be our primary sense of justice in that what am I owed? What do other people...
What are my rights?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And this is more about what do I owe to others, but how do I live in community?
Yeah.
And we've been talking about the virtues as these skills, these settled dispositions for action. It's not the action itself, it's the disposition to do good. And that living a good life is a happy life and flourishing, and that the good life is one informed by the virtues. And I think the real power of justice here that we're going to hopefully unpack is the idea that it's good for me to do good to others, that to have good relationships, to live well in community is part of my own flourishing. And so justice, first and foremost, is about thinking about how can I live well in community.
Yeah. So justice isn't principally about what is due to me, but actually about becoming a just person. And I can be a just person even in a circumstance when other people aren't giving me my dues.
Exactly. And it's also not describing, in this sense as a virtue, we're not describing a situation. We're not saying justice is a particular state of affairs. Here we're really thinking about the virtue. And we've mentioned that virtues perfect certain powers in the human person. We have these capacities and that make us human, and the virtues perfect them. And prudence, we looked at last time, perfects the intellect and into the will. And here, justice, we're really talking about a virtue that perfects the will, our capacity to desire the good and to do the good as well.
Yeah. So justice is desiring correctly, and a part of that desiring correctly is going to be about how I desire for others and recognizing what I can give to them, what is due to them.
Yeah, exactly. And something that's come up in a few different places is our understanding of virtue and the good life is premised on an understanding of the human person. We made this point a few times in the first episode, that it's because of who we understand, what we understand a human being to be is how we understand a human being flourishes, perfecting our powers and capacities and so on. And this is particularly true for justice, I think, as a way in. When would you say, as we're approaching this, you stopped being dependent on your parents, if that's not too personal a question?
Well, given that my mother does occasionally, she occasionally sees my alb and she's like, "Give that to me. I'll give that a wash." Yeah, because I feel like I'm being outed here. So my mother does still sometimes wash my alb because she thinks she does a much better job of it than I do.
Yes, so does mine.
I still am. I still am. Exist in a dependent relationship with there, and I don't think I've gone completely red because I'm not embarrassed about that. Because actually we're made for relationship, and just as we said in the first episode, the kind of the defining character of humankind is that we're a rational animal.
Yeah.
Well, it's also been said about another thing, that we're the social animal.
Yeah.
We live in social relationships, but there is a bit of a tendency going against that right now, isn't there?
I remember really enjoying an episode on Radio Maria, your radio station, with someone called Sofia Carrozza, I believe, who's a neuroscientist, and it was a fascinating episode on the neuroscience of the child and the relationship between the mother and the child's brain, and how basically the child is born with an unformed brain. And I think I was reading somewhere that essentially if a human being was to be born with a brain at the same level of development as a chimpanzee, we would need 18 months in the womb. That's sort of how unformed the brain is at birth. And I think it's easy for us to forget just how dependent we are as human beings in the animal kingdom. I mean, a baby calf, I think, can walk a few hours after being born. A duckling jumps into the water and swims just out after being hatched. We're dependent in a kind of quite literal sense for our existence for a number of years, and then dependent in lots of other ways after that. And it's something that's, I think, we easily forget it perhaps because we don't think about it, just how dependent we are on one another.
And it's interesting thinking that most animals, when they come out of the womb, immediately, or at least mammals, immediately seek to suckle or to feed. The first thing the human child looks for when it comes out of the womb is for recognition.
Yeah.
Seeks to make eye contact with the mother, and that desire to be seen feeds through. We hear people talk an awful lot now, like, I want to be seen.
Yeah.
And when they're talking about wanting to be seen, they're talking about wanting to be in relationship in some way. But I think there's a lot of cultural pressures pushing against that.
Yeah, I think, so the idea of our dependency, a great Catholic Scottish philosopher called Alistair MacIntyre wrote a wonderful book called Dependent Rational Animals. Rational animal being a technical definition of a human being, and that really we should think about ourselves as dependent rational animals. And in that book, he posits the opposite to that, which I think is the prevalent one in our society of without wanting to sound, in his technical terms, individual preference maximizers. And by that he means we do think of ourselves as individuals, and fundamentally we think of ourselves in terms of how can I maximize my preferences. And we spoke about Glaucon in the first episode. His view of morality definitely fits, which shows it's nothing new, which definitely fits MacIntyre's sense of a human being thinks of himself or herself as a preference maximizer.
And this gets to the way that I view myself and the way that I view the world, and that we were talking about in prudence. But do I see myself fundamentally as existing in relationship to other people, or do I see other people as most likely impinging upon me or getting in my way? Somebody who I've read a great deal of lately, and I just think he's fantastic, is Carl Trueman. He's got one really big book and then the shorter book that he was told to write because people won't read the big book. I did read the big book.
I've only read the shorter one.
The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Yeah. And they're drawing a lot upon the work of Charles Taylor, who's written an even bigger book, Indeed. Which I haven't yet read, called A Secular Age, but I've started and it's excellent. It talks about the buffered self. Yeah. And that once upon a time, if you'd asked somebody to introduce themselves, they would have told you, not as I did in our first episode, where I think I just told you about what I used to do before joining the order, but would have said, my name is Toby Lees, I'm the son of Christopher and Delia Lees, who are the children of, and would have told you about me in context to the relationships in my life. Yeah. Whereas now, much more likely to speak about myself in terms of, I'm Father Toby and I like to go on pilgrimages. I like reading books. I like real ale. I like cold water swimming. All in terms of my preferences, not in terms of the way that I relate to other people. Yeah. Whereas the reality is, though, that I tap the deepest meaning in my life from my relationships with other people. Yeah. But this is the way that we're encouraged to think about ourselves by just contemporary cultural tides. Yeah,
massively. And the dependency point definitely extends well beyond childhood. And if we think about the things we care about, how dependent we are on them for others, the common goods, the projects the most important to our life. Think about building a family or work, or even about learning a language, how dependent you are on what you receive from others is so important. And just to bring this back to justice, and we mentioned at the beginning, we often tend to think about justice about rights. You can see in these two models of the human person, on the one hand, the dependent rational animal, MacIntyre's emphasizing what's are dependence on others in community. On the other hand, this preference maximizer yields two quite different conceptions of justice. The preference maximizer is going to think more about rights, because if ultimately who I am is about what I want, the first thing I'm going to think about is, well, what's due to me? What are my rights? And the only obligations I'm going to have are those that I've chosen. I might recognize I have an obligation to a child because that's what I chose to have a child. I have an obligation to a spouse because that's what I chose to get married. Whereas the other picture of the human person sees things quite differently.
And I think as we're talking about virtues, hopefully one of the things to become apparent is that virtues give you real agency in the world. They affect the way that you act. And the same way what you're talking about there, the different conception, in one, I'm likely to be led to a life of like real frustration and annoyance. And we've all met the sort of person who complains about how life wasn't fair for them, how they didn't get this opportunity they deserved at work and they weren't treated right by this thing. And sometimes, people have had horrible things happen to them, like really unfair. But we also know the situation with the person where it's like, actually, you just needed to focus a little bit more on what you could do for other people. As opposed to life owed me this and I didn't get it and now I'm unhappy. And so the virtue of justice is something that abides in us. We think primarily about it in terms of how do I relate to other people? And it's liberating if we start to think, well, what is due to that other person from me? What is it that I have within my capacity to be able to give to them? That liberates and sets you free. And I think the other one just leads to frustration or to a desire for more power. And don't we see that now in contemporary society? I want more power in order that I can exist in the sort of relationship with these people who I want to. And normally it's seen in terms of oppressor and oppressed. And we've been oppressed for long enough. Now it's our turn to do the oppressing.
This word due we've been using quite a bit, and the classic definition of justice, which again stretches across the traditions, find it in St. Thomas Aquinas, who we've been mentioning a lot, but definitely outside of St. Thomas as well, that justice is the virtue of giving someone their due, giving someone his due. What exactly do you mean by due there? What's that getting at?
Well, it's inherent in that is the idea that I owe somebody something and that they are a certain type of thing as well, because we can recognize what is due to a cat is different to what is due to a dog, is what is due different to a human being. A human being happens to be your spouse, or a human being happens to be your superior or God.
And I think we can also look at the things that's due to someone in terms of what establishes that due. So at one level, maybe it's a contract. Someone mows the lawn of the London Priory and is then owed £10 or £20, whatever the going rate for gardeners is. I have no idea.
It's a bigger lawn.
Bigger
than
lawn,
that, yeah.
exactly. Exactly. So you do some work for someone, you're owed some money. That's a way in which something's due to you. And we might think about that as dues in terms of convention. And that can be extended far more widely. I have a right to vote in this country. I have a right to a jury trial and so on because exactly, for now.
Yeah.
And because the law has established that I have certain rights, that's rights of convention. And interestingly, again, picking up on Glaucon, that's his idea that all of justice is just that. It's convention, things have established my right. But we can also think about other kinds of dues that seem to belong to something more fundamental, such as the right to life, the right to bodily integrity, to not be slapped over the face by a fish, whatever your...
That was your first example that you go to. Is that, what's going on in the Priory in Leicester?
Yeah, who knows? Indeed. But the question then becomes, what's the origin of these natural rights? Because, again, our friend Glaucon will want to say all of those are simply convention. We just establish that you shouldn't murder someone because it's our way of keeping the peace and compromise. But I think we would want to say these are rooted in something deeper. And if we're thinking about human nature as explaining what it is to be a just person, that there's something in our nature that establishes these rights.
Yeah, I think it's worth just rewinding with Glaucon a bit there, because it shows actually how much the Judeo-Christian view has transformed the way that we understand ourselves, and that people take it for granted. Glaucon's idea with justice is that really we take delight in taking what is not our due from others, that this is the good life, this is what makes us happy. And the only reason that we decide not to do that and that we consent to laws is because actually when something is taken from us by other people, that the pain that I feel of that is greater than the delight that I take in taking from someone else.
Yeah.
So he really has this view that nobody wants justice, but we just consent to it. And so even the frame that we'd be having the conversation in now is one that's been completely altered by a Judeo-Christian sense of the world. And I think of God as having made us a certain type of thing.
Yeah. And that's exactly right in terms of thinking about what establishes these natural rights. And we would ultimately think about the right to life being established by the fact that we were created. And that proximately we can think about parents in the order of nature. Ultimately, theologically, we talk about God there. I remember a few years ago, there was this guy in India who sued his parents for giving birth to him. It was like a publicity stunt, an antinatalist movement of some kind. He knew it would get thrown out of the courts. But it, of course, raises the question, or makes it very clear, no one earns their right to be born.
Yeah.
No one deserves to be born in any way, which means by our very birth, we owe something before anything is due to us. We owe a debt to our parents and ultimately to God.
And those are the two relationships which Aquinas will say we can never really do perfect justice in that we can't return the gift that was given. All that we can really do is hand on. But we exist in this fundamental experience of the receipt of a gift, or at least if we see correctly, we do.
Exactly.
And I think living in that conception changes everything.
Yeah. And prudence, of course, is seeing that, being able to understand ourselves as being born into and inhabiting kind of a network of giving and receiving where the gift is primary, we first give. Pope John Paul II, I think it was, first spoke about the law of the gift, which I've often found a powerful idea, that when you're going through a tough time, actually to think about what can I give of myself in this situation, and then you receive in the measure that you give of yourself, and giving yourself away is a way of ultimately receiving even more. And I think that's picking up on this fundamental understanding of the human person who is brought into existence by a gift, and that's our origin.
There's the parable of the labourers in the vineyard, which I think is very powerful, where for people who are unaware, people turn up people are hired at certain points in the day, and the people who are hired at the last hour end up getting paid the same as the people who are hired for the full day. And unsurprisingly to us, and we can relate to the people who are hired at the first hour, they're a bit disgruntled when they see that the people who'd been paid 1 denarius for only working the last hour of the day, they're thinking, oh, we're going to get a load of more money here. But what we see in that is a conception of God's justice and the way that he's asking us to live, which is not to think strictly in terms of what do I owe this person in a purely contractual sense. Because we have this, it is right and just that if we sign a contract, we should fulfill it. But as Christians, we're called to go beyond that and say, not just what do I owe this person under obligation of law of the land, but actually what do I owe this person under the law of love?
Yeah.
And that's to give them what they need.
Yeah.
And that might be very different from what they're owed to me under a strict conception.
Yeah. That living justly is not about calculation, always counting the cost. That brings us on to perhaps to talk a little bit about some of the parts of justice. And justice is a huge topic, huge virtue. So St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae is his main work of theology, and the largest section of it, justice comes in the largest section of it, which is on the virtues, and it is itself the largest section of the section. Absolutely vast. So of course we're not going to cover everything. And you mentioned God and parents, so he talks there about virtues that of religion towards God and prayer and devotion, piety towards one's parents. Generosity is very important, kindness, friendliness, affability, and so on. And there's a huge amount to unpack there. One that I thought might be interesting to discuss a little bit is he speaks about the virtues that govern our use of words, because we often think about justice in terms of deeds, but of course speaking is an action, and justice governs how we speak as well. And it strikes me we often perhaps underestimate the power of our words in society. Words can both really build up, but do a lot of damage as well.
Yeah. I think whilst I have some reservations about how far things go in the attempt to be able to police people's speech online right now, I think there is a realization that words are incredibly powerful.
Completely.
And that you can sort of build up a false reputation, or you can defame someone, and that gets us to a sort of perennial sin, and one which many people come along and discuss and ask for help with, and I think our contemporary culture really encourages it, but which is gossip.
Yeah, gossip. And Aquinas has some what sound like quite technical words for this, and translated as things like backbiting and tale bearing, and there's a third one, I can't remember, but I think a German philosopher, Joseph Pieper, points out that I think it's telling that we're not very familiar with those words. Detraction is the third. And they're all different ways of essentially gossiping, of talking badly about someone, doing it in secret, undermining someone's good reputation when there is one. I suppose we're less familiar with those kinds of vices, the opposite of virtues, bad habits, and that terminology, because we don't really think about the power of what bad speech can really do.
I think it's a really destructive way to live in the world as well, where contemporary online media culture encourages us to find out bad things about people, and to click on articles, and it does us no good whatsoever. And this idea that a person is entitled to their good reputation. Yeah,
and that shows connection again between virtues. Prudence of the mind is related to a healthy understanding of a use of our minds, and curiosity we could think about as a kind of a vice that we'll maybe discuss more when we come to temperance.
Another sub virtue which is worth mentioning, because I was very interested when I read a book on formation in the virtues for priests, which was really, really good, and this particular volume was on justice. Yeah. And he starts off with thanksgiving, and says that the seminarian should live in a fundamental sort of attitude of thanks for the fact of his formation, of thanks for the fact of his teaching. Yeah. And you see with a lot of contemporary psychology now, I'm a big fan of Arthur Brooks, who does a lot on happiness, and various other people, that the person who gives thanks, the person who experiences gratitude, is actually much, much happier than the person who has the attitude of entitlement. Yeah. I don't know what shampoo you use. It's not because I'm seeing any dandruff right now.
Yeah, but, exactly.
The lighting's quite bright.
Yeah, indeed. What shampoo do I
Yeah.
use? I can't remember what the brand is. I think it's just like an almond brand or something.
Well, there's this
I
part of
don't
community
know
life,
much
like
about
you get whatever gets put in,
exactly.
in the showers. But I joke and I say that L'Oreal is the devil's
because,
shampoo
because you're worth
because
it.
of the slogan, because I'm worth it.
Yeah.
If you exist in that mentality, thinking always like what was due to me,
Yeah.
as opposed to like the attitude of gratitude,
Yeah.
that's completely transformational, and that's a part of living justly, is to recognize the gift.
Because it's living most fundamentally in tune with our nature as created beings who, before we can be due anything, are given something, which is our existence, to be dependent on God.
Yeah.
Just as a final virtue, perhaps to discuss, related to both those in some ways, is truthfulness. I suppose also related to speech, but I think in a slightly different way. We might not think of truth as something we actually owe someone, but I think it's true that you do, using the word of faith, you do owe someone to speak the truth to them.
Or indeed, truth is relational.
Indeed, yes.
Because the definition of truth, which Aquinas will take, is about being in right relation, in our minds to reality.
Yeah.
Not truth as simply just learning facts.
Yeah.
But perceiving correctly.
Yeah.
Having the correct image of things
And
in our head.
Yeah. And I was struck in looking at this, that the idea of truth that St. Thomas speaks about there as belonging to justice, a skill that we would develop, isn't just with words, but in actions too. And at first glance, it might look like St. Thomas's version of you do you. He says you should show up as you really are. And so you should be authentic, would be a nice modern way of putting it. But of course, it's completely the opposite of you do you, because it's showing up as you really are, which is recognizing your nature as fundamentally created, an identity that's been given to you before you shaped anything. And I suppose a you do you approach to showing up is whatever you do is fine.
Yeah, and the writing of St. John Paul II in his Theology of the Body is so beautiful on this, when he unpacks Adam's experience of seeing Eve for the first time, and this at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. That he understands himself in light of the other, and he realizes his capacity of making a gift of himself to the other person. It's like the very, very opposite of you do you, but sin seems to bring into the world like you do you.
Yeah. And this perhaps leads us on to thinking about courage, because often it's difficult to make those judgments or to confront someone if you think they've made a bad decision. How do you sum up the courage to approach that, which does leave us very nicely for our next episode. Thank you. Good Habits is a CTS production in collaboration with the Dominican Friars in Britain
and Radio Maria England. And if you've liked this episode, which I sincerely hope you have, then please do like and subscribe.